Every civilization that ever collapsed was warned first. Not by an enemy at the gate. By a feeling in its own chest, the feeling that it had finally, deservedly, arrived. That feeling is the last thing a strong man ever notices going wrong, because it doesn't feel like losing. It feels like winning. We are told, from the time we're old enough to want anything, that struggle is the price and comfort is the prize. Work hard, so that one day you don't have to. Climb, so that one day you can stop climbing. Suffer now, cash it in later for a life with no more sharp edges. It's such a natural idea that almost nobody stops to check whether it's true. And it isn't. Comfort is not the reward waiting at the end of strength. Comfort is very often the mechanism that quietly ends it. I want to show you why, using history, biology, and a few uncomfortable questions about your own week. And then I want to show you what the people who actually stay dangerous do differently, on purpose, every single day. Let's start with a soldier. In the autumn of 480 BC, 300 Spartans held a mountain pass against an army so large that ancient writers simply gave up trying to count it accurately. They didn't hold that pass because they were the strongest men in Greece. They held it because for their entire lives, the state had engineered discomfort into every hour of their existence, cold, hunger, pain, humiliation, deliberately, from childhood, as policy. Not cruelty for its own sake. A theory. The theory was that a body and a will that have never been allowed to soften cannot be broken by circumstance, because circumstance has nothing left to take away. Now put next to that a very different army, one that had already won. By 216 BC, Hannibal Barca had done something that should have ended Rome. At Cannae, his forces surrounded and destroyed a Roman army so large that the battle is still taught in military academies as a textbook case of total annihilation. Rome had no army left to stop him. The road to the capital was open. His men had crossed mountains, buried comrades, eaten leather, and won anyway, over and over, for years. They were, by any measure, among the hardest fighting men who ever lived. That winter, they were given a city. Capua welcomed them, heated baths, soft beds, easy food, easy company, an entire season with nothing asked of them at all. And the ancient historian Livy recorded what happened when spring came and they had to become an army again. They couldn't. The discipline was gone. Men who had shrugged off the Alps deserted over a cold night in a tent. An old line survived from that period, repeated for centuries afterward. That Capua did to Hannibal's army what Rome's legions never could. Not a single sword was drawn. A winter of comfort did what 10 years of war had failed to do. Whether you take that story at full historical face value or as a legend the Romans like to tell about the limits of victory, they didn't keep repeating it for 1,000 years because it was a fluke. They repeated it because they kept watching it happen, to kings, to generals, to their own sons. Here's the pattern underneath both of those stories. Hardship, deliberately kept, builds a kind of internal armor. Comfort, unearned and unbroken, quietly dissolves it. And the strange part is that the dissolving never feels like a loss while it's happening. It feels wonderful. Which means if you want to understand why this keeps happening to strong men across every century, you have to stop looking at history for a minute and look at the machinery in your own skull. Here's what almost everyone gets backwards about the brain's reward system. We call dopamine the pleasure chemical, and that's not really what it is. Dopamine is the chemistry of wanting, the surge that happens in anticipation, in the reach, in the chase. It's what makes an animal move towards something before it has it. It fires hardest in the pursuit, not in the having. In a very real sense, it's the chemical signature of a creature with somewhere to be. The psychiatrist Anna Lemke, who has spent her career studying addiction, describes the brain's pleasure system as a seesaw with pleasure on one side and pain on the other, and the brain's entire job is to keep that seesaw level. Tip it hard toward pleasure, any source, and the brain doesn't just enjoy the ride. It fights back. It pushes weight onto the other side to restore balance. And it doesn't stop pushing the instant the seesaw goes flat. It overshoots, tipping you down into a small deficit, a come-down, a flatness, before it finally settles. You felt that overshoot 1,000 times and blamed it on the wrong thing. The flat, gray mood after a binge of anything. The dead hour after a weekend built entirely around ease. That isn't a separate bad feeling that happens to interrupt your pleasure. It's the same transaction, on a delay. You didn't get pleasure and then, unluckily, feel bad afterward. The bad afterward is the pleasure, arriving late, as a bill. Keep tipping that seesaw, the endless scroll, the sugar, the easy stimulation stacked from the moment you wake up, and the system stops resetting on its own schedule. It adapts downward. It pulls back its own sensitivity so the constant flood doesn't overwhelm it. Brain imaging research on people with heavy dependence, including work from the researcher Nora Fokow, has found dopamine signaling running below normal baseline. Not during the high, but weeks into abstinence from it. The person chasing the most pleasure ends up feeling the least. There's a clinical name for that particular flatness, anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure in things that should produce it. The man living in that state doesn't need stimulation to feel good anymore. He needs it just to feel ordinary, to climb back up to the baseline everyone else stands on for free. Sit with how backwards that is for a second. A system built to make you hunt has been quietly rewired into a system that just makes you graze. And the grazing animal isn't dangerous to anything. It gets worse, because pleasure doesn't just flatten your baseline, it can retrain what you're even capable of wanting in the first place. In the 1950s, a researcher named Frank Beach documented something that's since been replicated across nearly every species anyone has tested it on. Put a male animal with a mate. He engages. He engages again. Eventually he's spent, by every visible measure, done, uninterested, finished. Then introduce an unfamiliar mate. He's instantly, fully re-engaged. Not rested, restarted. Researchers named this the Coolidge effect, and inside the brain it isn't subtle, dopamine collapses with the familiar and spikes sharply the moment novelty appears. The drive was never really about the act at all. It was about the new. Now hold that next to the device most of us carry everywhere. For nearly all of human history, novelty was rare, and it was earned, a new hunting ground, a new territory, a new person, all of it cost real effort and real risk. Your reward circuitry evolved for a world where new showed up a few times a year, if you fought for it. We have since built machines that manufacture novelty without end and put one in every pocket for free. A limitless scroll of new faces, new stimulation, each swipe a fresh spike, each spike teaching the system that the next one might be even better than this one. Researchers studying compulsive digital and pornographic consumption describe exactly this pattern, not simple repetition, but an escalating chase toward more novelty and more extremity just to reach the level of arousal an ordinary stimulus used to produce without effort. The appetite doesn't get satisfied. It gets trained to need more than real life will ever be able to supply. And this is the part that should genuinely bother you. A person feeding that engine constantly isn't just wasting time. He's recalibrating his entire wanting system around a stimulus that no real relationship, no real accomplishment, no ordinary Tuesday can compete with. He sits across from someone who loves him and feels a static he can't name. He hits a goal he worked years for and it tastes like nothing, because his baseline for exciting has been dragged somewhere the real world can't follow. And here's the cruelest part, he doesn't experience any of this as self-inflicted. He experiences it as the world going flat. The job seems dull. The relationship seems dull. The city seems dull. He'll spend years hunting for some external thing to fix a feeling that was never actually about anything external. Because the part of him that was supposed to feel alive is the part he's been quietly burning out. I've described all of this so far like an accident, an unfortunate side effect of a world that got rich faster than our brains could adapt. It's worth being less polite about that, because for most of human history, this was not an accident. It was a strategy. Ask an old question about power, how do you neutralize a man too dangerous to kill? Killing him creates a martyr, sparks a grudge from his family, invites a reprisal from whoever loved him. Cruder rulers tried that path and spent their whole reigns putting out the fires it started. The more patient ones discovered something better. You don't imprison the dangerous rival. You give him a palace. Every comfort a man could name, arranged so completely, so continuously, that the hunger which made him dangerous quietly dissolves on its own, with nobody's hand visibly on the lever. He isn't fighting anymore. He's choosing between desserts. And he will defend the very cage that hollowed him out, because it's upholstered, and because from the inside it never once felt like a cage. Deposed rulers across history were routinely pensioned into exactly this kind of luxury, specifically so the hunger to reclaim power would fade before the opportunity ever did. A gilded life turns out to be a far more reliable prison than an iron one, for one simple reason. The prisoner stops wanting the door. Now look at what surrounds you today, and notice that this doesn't require a conspiracy to be true, that's actually the more unsettling version of the story. Nobody is sitting in a room plotting your personal softening. It's stranger than that. The same mechanism has simply been industrialized and pointed at everyone at once, not by a tyrant, but by an economy that discovered, almost by accident, that the single most profitable thing it can build is something that keeps that seesaw tipped toward pleasure forever. Every app engineered to never quite end. Every flavor optimized in a lab past the point your body would normally say stop. Every form of stimulation delivered faster and more intensely than any point in human history. None of it needs a mastermind. It only needs incentives, and incentives are patient. The old rulers had to physically capture a man to soften him. Now people quietly build the palace themselves and lock the door from the inside, and call it a good life. That's the actual reframe worth sitting with. Pleasure was never the reward waiting at the finish line of a hard life. For most of history it has been closer to a weapon. We tend to assume the most powerful person in any room is the one indulging the most luxury, the most ease, the most access to pleasure. Sometimes that's the display, because display serves a purpose. But watch what genuinely formidable people actually do when nobody's performing for anyone, and you tend to find something closer to restraint than indulgence. They ration. They train discomfort deliberately, the way you train a muscle. Cold instead of warm, the harder conversation instead of the easy avoidance, hunger instead of automatic fullness. Not because restraint is virtuous for its own sake, but because they understand exactly the mechanism we just walked through, and they are protecting the engine. They keep their own wanting sharp on purpose, because a sharp appetite is the source of everything they've ever built, and they refuse to let it get dulled for free by something as cheap as convenience. That's the move the merely comfortable man never makes. Not permanent deprivation, not asceticism as a personality, just the routine, deliberate refusal of an easy reward that's sitting right there, free, asking nothing of him. Leaving it on the table on purpose, over and over, because the ability to do exactly that turns out to be one of the rarer forms of power there is. It's the difference between an animal that walks past a meal because it isn't hungry on its own terms, and one that eats whatever's put in front of it the instant it's put there. One of those animals owns its own appetite. The other is owned by it. Which is really the whole question this comes down to. Not whether you can get pleasure. Pleasure has never in human history been easier to get than it is for you, right now, today, delivered to your hand at any hour you like, asking nothing in return. The real question is whether you can still turn it down. Whether, when the easy thing is sitting right there, frictionless, free, you still have the one muscle left that can say not now. If you do, you're still dangerous in the way that actually matters. If you can't remember the last time you turned down a pleasure you were fully capable of having, then somewhere along the line, quietly, pleasantly, without anyone ever raising a hand against you, you were already fed. There's a small, strange scene near the very end of Herodotus's Histories, written roughly 2,500 years ago. The Persians had just become the most powerful people on earth. They had conquered everything worth conquering, and a group of nobles came to their king, Cyrus, with what sounded like an obviously sensible idea. Now that they ruled the world, why keep living on their harsh, rocky, unforgiving homeland? Why not move the whole people to somewhere richer, softer, easier, somewhere that actually looked like what conquerors deserved? Cyrus heard them out, and then told them they could do it, but that they should understand exactly what it would cost. Soft ground, he told them, breeds soft men. Rich soil and strong warriors have never grown from the same field. Move to the easier country, he warned, and prepare to stop being rulers and start being someone else's subjects. Herodotus chose to end the entire history of the greatest empire of his era not with a battle, but with that one warning, because he had watched the whole arc play out before, and he knew exactly what comfort does to people who have forgotten what actually made them strong, and he knew it always feels, in the moment, like the obvious and reasonable thing to do. Of course we've earned the easier life. Of course the whole point of the struggle was to finally get to stop. The Persians, that day, chose to stay on the hard ground rather than move to the easy valley. That was the day they were still the ones holding the world, instead of the ones being held by it. You make some smaller version of that same choice constantly, and nobody ever announces it out loud. There's no wise old king standing at your door making the case for the mountain. There's just the soft thing, sitting there, asking nothing of you. And a quieter and quieter voice somewhere underneath it, asking whether you're still the kind of person who can walk past it. The lion was never actually killed. In most of these stories, it was simply fed, patiently, comfortably, until it forgot what it used to be. The only real question left, for you, this week, not for Rome or Persia or Carthage, is whether you still remember.